Well, thank you. Thank you for being here. Let's get started. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to another First Year Friday. Well, let me say that more accurately. It's First Year Friday, but certainly not just another one. It isn't every day that we have a former governor of Maryland and 8-year member of the U.S. House of Representatives come by to lead a classroom discussion. However, we are fortunate to have Governor Robert L. Ehrlich, Jr. with us today to discuss something he cares about deeply, although it is an issue that has received relatively little attention this election season. The issue of how the principles of justice still apply to those convicted of crimes, and why our criminal justice policies in this regard should transcend partisan politics. Governor Ehrlich grew up near Baltimore at Arbutus, Maryland. He attended Princeton University and Wake Forest Law School. Governor Ehrlich served as the 60th governor of Maryland from 2003 to 2007, and in Congress as a member of the House of Representatives from 1995 to 2003. Governor currently acts as senior counsel with the Government Advocacy and Public Policy Group at King & Spalding, while also managing the presidential campaign for Mitt Romney in Maryland. Governor Ehrlich's tenure as chief executive of the state of Maryland was a distinguished one. Among other achievements, he is credited with strongly supporting education. During his administration, Maryland opened its first ever public charter school, constructed 45 new schools, and renovated an additional 52 schools. He signed the Chesapeake Bay Restoration Act. This funded upgrades to water treatment plants to reduce pollution. And he established the Office of Secretary of Disabilities. This was the first cabinet-level disabilities office in any state in the nation. But it is his record on the criminal justice system that has caught the attentions of politicians, academics, and the mainstream press. We are very, very fortunate to have Governor Ehrlich here to address us on that. And at this point, let me turn the podium over to Professor Kara Drinan, who teaches criminal law and whose scholarship focuses on criminal justice reform. Thank you.
Thank you, Dean Garvey. Just since we had one phone go off, I just want to remind folks, since we are in a classroom rules apply, and I, in fact, will invoke the Professor Fishman rule that if a phone rings, I will answer it. So, or the governor will answer it, one or the other. So thank you, Dean Garvey, and all of you for being here today. You are in for a real treat, I can assure you. It's my honor to introduce Governor Ehrlich to you today. You've heard a little bit about his political record and what he has accomplished as a public servant. I want to say a little bit about clemency in general to provide some context. So if you're in my criminal law class, you've already heard about rates of incarceration in this country and why our current corrections policy in this nation is so problematic. The governor will address that to some extent in his talk, but I want to give you some context so that you understand how truly innovative and courageous the governor has been in the area of criminal justice reform. So just by way of background, so folks understand, every state grants the governor or some executive body the power to grant clemency, right? That is the power to pardon or commute a criminal sentence. And that power is deeply rooted in our American history. And as recently as the first half of the 20th century, it was a regularly exercised power. Even in states with traditionally high execution rates. So I hate to pick on Texas, I always pick on Texas, but let's pick on Texas. So in Texas, between 1923 and 1972, Texas executed 461 people, but during that same time period, Texas governors commuted 100 sentences. That's a pretty good ratio. Today, state clemency grants have all but disappeared from the political landscape. So in 1976, when the death penalty was reinstated, since then, I should say, since 1976, when the death penalty was reinstated, Texas has executed 487 people, while it has granted clemency for only 2 inmates. Some capital states have not commuted any death sentences in that same time period. There have been a few, and only a few, notable exceptions to this clemency trend, and Governor Ehrlich is one such exception. Despite being a Republican governor in a widely considered Democratic state, the governor worked tirelessly to develop and implement a fair and smart criminal justice policy. He adopted a first-of-its-kind clemency approach that standardized the process and provided intensive rehabilitative services to those whose cases were either pardoned or whose sentences were commuted. I will let him share with you the details of that program and his incredibly successful track record, but please join me in welcoming Governor Ehrlich.
Hi, everybody. So be honest now. It's a pretty good turnout for Friday afternoon. Raise your hand if you are here as a function of a discretionary decision. Extra credit for everybody with their hand. Raise your hand if you're here mandatorily. All right. I'm a little less impressed, but anyway. Great crowd, and Dean Garvey, it's great to see you. It's great to be back on this campus. Carr, thank you for the both great introductions. I brought some friends of mine here today, and I want to introduce them because they pertain to our topic. Actually, the first one does not. Pat Mulford. Patrick, stand up. Pat is my aide and helps me with research and books and speeches and goes around the East Coast with me and is a great, valuable member of my team. Greg Massoni, on the other hand, how about that, on the other hand, was my former press secretary and is a colleague with me at King & Spalding. He is not a lawyer. He is a press secretary. He hates lawyers, actually, with a few exceptions. Yeah, you don't hate him. But Greg was part of, and we'll get to this in a bit, Greg was part of my team that met on a monthly basis with respect to this process that we instituted that Carr began to describe. And Greg played an interesting role for very obvious reasons, and we'll get to those reasons in a minute as well. Charlie, stand up and introduce yourself. Charley Sullivan, my friend. Tell everybody what you do.
My name is Charley Sullivan. I am co-director with my wife, Pauline, of an organization called CURE, Citizens United for Rehabilitation of Parents. Parents always cause us a little bit of errors. People make mistakes. We can all admit people make mistakes. But what we do is we try to mobilize families of prisoners, former prisoners, and concerned citizens to some type of constituency for prison reform. And so errance is important in that if you are a family member and you're living in a prison town, you're not anxious for everybody to know that you have a loved one incarcerated. So we kind of count. We do have a lot of people who are have loved ones incarcerated. So it's great. This is a historic occasion.
Thank you, my friend. Today's game plan is simple. A couple observations with regard to the macro issue of incarceration, mandatory sentences, what public policy decisions made, mostly at the state level of the 1980s, have brought to our criminal justice system today. And then I'm going to go over just real briefly the key constituent elements with regard to the process that we began, instituted, and worked pretty darn well in the state of Maryland during my tenure. And then, your turn. Open up for Q&A, and then we'll get you out of here. So, the background numbers, and Carr, I'm sure you're very well familiar with this. You've probably been tested on some of these numbers. I'm not going to bore you with a lot of statistics. But in 1980, the ratio was as follows: 150 per 100,000. 150 incarcerated Americans out of 100 per 100,000 Americans. Today, that number is 753. 753 per 1,000, comparing it to some of our friends in Europe, Great Britain 153, Germany 90, France 96. So we live in a nation that imprisons a higher percentage of its people than any other nation in the world today, which drives a lot of public policy issues that we're going to discuss over the next hour. At the federal level, well, let me first say that you've learned, and some of you have lived through some of the primary reasons for this development. We have incredible overcrowding at the local, state, and federal level. And a lot of that as a result of public policy decisions that were made in the 1980s. Mandatory minimum sentences, truth in sentencing, no parolable offenses. In the 1980s, I was a member of the state legislature in Maryland, and we would spend a lot of time talking about the predicate offenses, increasing the predicate offenses that would get juveniles waived into adult court, because the whole idea was tough on crime. Increasingly violent, particularly increasingly violent drug offenders, needed to do adult time. Throw away the key. That was sort of the mantra, both liberal and conservative, left and right, Republican and Democrat. So a lot of state legislatures during that era instituted these reforms in response to a public outcry with respect to crime rates around the country. As I said, mandatory minimums, truth in sentencing, expanded adult jurisdiction, all help explain our present crisis. At the federal level, if you read the Washington Post, you know we have a almost completely dysfunctional pardons office at DOJ. And we'll get into that in a second as well. The system appears to exist to protect career prosecutors rather than the office of the president, which is its supposed purpose. At the state level, executive disinterest is more the rule. Some governors have just no interest in the issue. Some are not lawyers. They don't get to go to great law schools like this one. They're not particularly interested in the area. They haven't dealt with crime and punishment issues. They're not particularly sensitive to even the fiscal repercussions of high incarceration rates. So they don't think about it until they become governor. Others are lawyers. They're familiar with the issues, but because of politics, because of this particular issue, and the lack of political attractiveness attached to the issue, they've decided simply to not do anything about it. The bottom line is that the pardon and communications power at the state and federal levels is in decline, significant decline. During a time of sentencing guidelines and drug possession offenses particularly have created severe overcrowding in our state and federal prisons. Which brings me to the primary goal here today, which is to just review briefly the process that we institute in the state of Maryland. Now, I inherited, and governors actually love to do this, every football coach loves to be hired with a great recruiting class after a lousy season, right? You can only go up. Same thing with politicians. No difference. So there was no interest by my Democratic successors, and we'll get into the philosophical and partisan aspects to this in a second. But there was no, in fact, my very liberal predecessor as governor, Governor Glendenning, famously said, "Life is life. See ya. We're not going to revisit these cases. That's just the way it is." So we inherited not a broken system, we inherited a non-existent system. So I got to really do some stuff that I wanted to do very early on, and I had the ability to do it. This is one of the few areas left. For those of you who want to be governors, raise your hand if you want to run for governor of some state someday. Be honest. There you go. I like that. Think about this. This is one of the few areas left where you have almost complete autonomy. Different states have different systems. In Maryland, similar to the budget process, the governor has a lot of power. And you can do good things with power from time to time as governor. So we began with putting in place a more formalized system, which meant we only took cases from the Parole Commission. So there was a vetting at the first level. Secondly, we took very seriously victim notification. If you're going to do this, there's certain things you better do. And one is victim notification. The last thing you need to do, or he needs to experience, is to have a press conference where a commutation of sentence is being announced and the victim comes forward and said, "You got to be kidding me." You talk about a damper on your press conference, right? Third, the law in Maryland is published notices of decision, which again gets to Greg, because governors in Maryland can't do this secretly. It will be in the paper. People will know, the press will follow it. So if you want to be sneaky, think again. You're not going to be sneaky, successful at least in this respect. Following these basic elements allows you to establish regular process, and for your detractors and the media, and they overlap a lot, no surprises. The goal here is no surprises. The goal here is regular process. The goal here is, there's Ehrlich just doing his thing again, because he said he would. Every month, like clockwork. Last minute, voluminous, surprise, commutations and pardons result in really bad press. Ask President Clinton, ask Governor Barbour. Communication. Surprisingly, I guess to some, this is an issue that I always thought, and I was a member of Congress, and I didn't think I was running for governor, and I really hadn't thought about this a great deal, though I was married to a public defender. We dated. She was a public defender. We got married. She became a prosecutor, so I take credit for that. But this is something that when I first thought of it, and knowing a little history with the framers and Lincoln and past presidents, particularly a couple hundred years ago, the pardon power was a very important part of the presidency. And I assumed around the country that governors took the pardon power seriously because I intended to do it as governor. And I soon found out, when I made my announcement for governor and began to really pay attention to Annapolis again, as opposed to Capitol Hill, which I have for the last decade at that time, that the pardon authority, the pardon power in Maryland had fallen into, again, not disrepair, but non-use. So I saw it as part of a governor's job description. And in order, again, to diffuse future bad press and negative attention, I not only talked about it during the campaign, I made it a point of emphasis in the campaign. Now, later on, by the way, in my continuing attempt to mainstream this issue, whenever a real innocent person, and they're relatively rare, the Innocence Project here, I know, whenever I had an innocence pardon, I went nuts. We would have a big press conference because typically egregious circumstances, somebody had been behind bars for 30 years, and a witness had recanted or DNA evidence had, in any event, exculpatory evidence had come to light years after a person had been convicted, years after the person had been in the system. So you have a guy, usually a guy in his 50s, who'd been in jail since his 20s and 30s, and as a member of the Board of Public Works in Maryland, a three-person panel, including the governor, we had to vote on the dollars we would give this person for the state of Maryland incorrectly incarcerating that person over so many years. Now, go lock yourself in a closet for 20 minutes today and think about someone accused of rape or murder, locked away, who did not do it. How much is that worth? Do you quantify it by the second, minute, hour, day, week, month, or year? So it was a very difficult thing to do. And on behalf of 6.5 million people, I got to say, we're sorry. We apologize. And here's your 900,000 or your 1,000,001 or whatever it was, and good luck. Regardless of political orientation, philosophical predisposition, everyone identifies with that situation. That person didn't do it, they got locked up, man. So we would try to give those cases additional publicity as a result, innocence pardons. I also believe this, there was less politically radioactive than it had been in the past. Less racial overtones than in the past. Less social economic overtones than in the past. Some of you will remember President Clinton and Midnight Basketball. Some of you remember the Willie Hortonization of this process with Willie Horton. By the way, Willie Horton was a Democratic ad ran against Michael Dukakis first. So both sides played the Willie Horton game. And for those, everybody know who Willie Horton is, by the way? You know, a horrible situation in Massachusetts where ads got ran against Governor Dukakis for a notorious pardon of a person who was a very violent person and reoffended. And so the Willie Hortonization of this process has been one underlying reason why governors and presidents have been so scared of this issue over the past couple decades. In any event, I believe that because the criminal justice system has touched so many families in every line we draw in our society, race, ethnicity, religion, class, name the line. It's touched so many families, poor, working class, middle class, upper middle class, the wealthy, that it's less radioactive in the past, so that a governor or a president can really get into this, because my third cousin got 10 years for a couple joints, and that was a second or third offense, and how fair is that? It's hit so many families, 753 out of 100,000. So as a result of simply the volume of individuals it's touched, it's safer. Now, Charlie will tell you, and Carl will tell you, counterintuitively, Republican governors have been more active on this issue than Democratic governors. More conservative governors have been more active than more liberal governors. This was not Nixon goes to China on my part. This was not, hey, let's do something to really throw them off. Let's be a liberal on an issue. It was, this is part of the job description. This is what governors do. And when you say life is life, you're not doing your job. Particularly if you get circumstances surrounding a case that raise real questions about, exculpatory evidence. So, take that as it is. Third, investigation. If you're going to do this, do it right. I had 5 lawyers work for me in my Office of Legal Counsel. 2.5 were permanently engaged every day on this issue. We made it a priority, and politicians will say, this is a priority, that's a priority. Well, in life, if everything's a priority, nothing's a priority. If you devote resources to something, it by definition is a priority. My staff, the press, the general public who followed this knew this was a priority because I assigned people to do it. And the process was once a month for, seemed like endless to you, I know, forever. We would sit at the governor's mansion, pretty good digs, by the way, I have to say, and my staff would present 30 to 40 cases a month. And some were really easy. Some were really easy. Fist fight in Ocean City in 1973. It's 35 years later. A person needs that expunged, needs a pardon because he or she wants to get a job at NSA. That's an easy one. 20 years ago, DWI, no big deal. 7 years ago, DWI. 4 years ago, DWI. 40 years ago, marijuana possession. 7 years ago, cocaine possession. I mean, you can just see, you can change the facts here. They go from real easy to increasingly difficult. And I would sit there with my legal staff, with my press secretary, with the Lieutenant Governor, Mike Steele, known to many of you, and a couple members of his staff, and we would discuss the cases. And I pretended it was a democracy. They knew it wasn't because it was pretty autocratic. It was my decision. But I wanted to get a vote on some close calls, and I would certainly take that into consideration, but it was ultimately my call every time. And that's how we did it. Interestingly, not surprisingly, and think about this, when my lawyers called prosecutors, public defenders, private attorneys, judges to reopen cold cases and ask potentially embarrassing questions, they did not get a very positive response. It was not, hey, the governor called. No, the governor's lawyer called about that case from 24 years ago, that one-day trial where he had a questionable witness ID, and they took a plea. It was 30 years, and the co-defendant's been out for 20, and our guy wasn't the shooter. And, oh, that one. Sometimes tough cases that people rather forget, but where justice was not accomplished. Use your common sense. Because of my wife and I are very close, as many of you know, and she had been in the system, oftentimes really tough cases, I just come home and talk to her and get her thoughts. Because the stakes were so high when you're talking about commuting lifer cases, for example, the more difficult cases I would sit on. If I wasn't pleased, if I just, in my own mind, I had to be really pretty sure that this was the right thing to do, because there were significant repercussions for a bad decision. Fourth, markers. Be honest with yourself. What are your markers? What is really important in this process that your staff needs to know that you can't violate, that we're not going to make exceptions for? I had two: veracity and child support. Veracity, obviously, and in many cases I send our lawyers back and talk numerous times. I wanted the truth to the extent we could find it, to the extent I was satisfied that it actually was the truth. And secondly, with regard to child support, and these are pardon cases, obviously, I just was never going to give anyone relief if they were in arrears on the child support. If someone was in that situation, in my view, there was no excuse for it, and you're coming to the governor for relief on a totally unrelated matter, but that was my marker, and everybody had to know it, and we set it out. Finally, and I'll open for questions in a second here, some thoughts and observations. One, friendships will be tested. One of my best friends in life, my lawyer, brought me a stinker, a client. And I know the client hired him because, hey, he's Bobby's friend. I'll hire my friend, yeah. So he brought it to my staff, and it was a stinker. And I said no to one of my best friends in life on a big case. And because it was him, I told my staff to look at it again, right? And guess what? It was no again. I guess he paid his bill, but it was still no. Friendships will be tested. Secondly, inappropriate contact will occur. On my last day in office, a judge in the state of Maryland was desperately trying to get a hold of me, totally inappropriately, to secure a pardon for a person. My lawyer, Jerby Finney, former U.S. attorney, really protected me always in this regard. Staff, what question did you always ask? Why are we doing this? We get no credit from the right. We get no credit from the left. There's no constituency. Why are we doing this as Republicans in a state where we're barely breathing always? By the way, I'm here representing all living Maryland Republican governors today. So the question is, why are you doing this? You're not going to get political credit for it. All you can get is grief or worse. And the answer to that is, it's the job description of a governor. You do justice. You're given extraordinary power by the people to achieve justice. And in this case, in a unilateral way, which is pretty neat, pretty cool. Your political quotient, your courage quotient will always be tested, obviously, as a result. Now, I'm not politically correct, so I'm just going to say it. This is not about ratios. It's not about sex, race, ethnicity. It's not about we have to pardon so many people with a certain background. It's nothing to do with that. It's simply the cases that appear in front of you. Now, if race or ethnicity or class happens to be an issue in the case, obviously, it's relevant. But it's not a set-aside. It's not a quota. It's justice, and justice is blind. As a result, the chips will fall where they may. You shouldn't keep count. Unfortunately, the media does, as Greg will tell you. And if you've reviewed some of the post pieces with President Bush's pardons, Race has been an issue, and that's unfortunate. Finally, it's leadership. The issue is easy to ignore. It's really easy to not make this part of your portfolio as governor or president. But in my view, again, you're not doing your job. It's about leadership. And if you don't want to exhibit leadership, don't be an executive. Conclusion, some of you may recall that I have plans for a new research and clinical center for clemency studies. Initial reports in the Post got us a lot of attention. 5 law schools contacted us with regard to this center. It would serve as an advocacy and policy center for executive clemency. There would be a clinical aspect as well because it was to be housed at a law school. So it's certainly, it's still in negotiations, and we're talking to a lot of folks, but it's certainly something that is exciting and important. And I've already been contacted by a lot of people around the country saying, give me a pardon. We haven't even set it up yet. But this system is really broken, and everybody knows it. And I hope whoever the next president is, and obviously I have a favorite in that regard, at least begins to fix it. President Obama had Greg Craig, one of the leading lawyers in this town, come in and try to fix it at DOJ his first year. And I hope to be with Greg Craig soon, but Greg Craig will tell you that it was just impossible to fix it in that short a time. Hopefully this center I'm discussing will host newly elected governors, both parties, and their chiefs of staff in order to educate them as to the importance of this issue, particularly non-lawyers in their states, and make this part of their transition plan. So I hope all of you will follow our progress. Thanks for being here today, and we'll open up for questions. Thank you. I'll make Greg available for answers and questions too, because as the press guy, he always voted no. Most. Yes.
On the issue of just basic criminal justice and sentencing
Yeah.
reform in general, it does seem like there. Oh, thank you. It does seem like there could be some common ground there because, I mean, politics is so partisan now, and all we seem to focus on is the economy and these things that really fixing it, and it seems to divide us so much. But it does seem like there could be a lot of common ground on sentencing reform in general. But how do you think that, as students graduating from law school now and being involved in politics, how do we get that started, even get the conversation started to start making these changes happen?
You're, as an individual, it's going to be impossible for you as one person just coming out of law school to do it. But as part of a team, as part of a greater effort, obviously there's the opportunity. And there's so many different levels. I mean, the center I'm talking about is part of it. Getting the next president, whomever it is, to be interested in this issue and to fix DOJ is a huge task. You might volunteer for somebody running for governor in some state and have some influence on, if that person gets elected, making this part of the agenda. So there's a multitude of ways to do it, but your denominator is correct. This is one of the few issues, because of some of the reasons I've articulated, that both parties, regardless of philosophical predisposition, can find some common ground. Now, there's always going to be fear. There's always going to be a fear of the next Willie Horton, obviously. So this has to be done in a very careful way. What I find interesting as a more conservative Republican is the lack of interest in this issue by liberal Democrats. And it's sort of, as I said, this is not Nixon goes to China for me, but it could be. You know, it could have been. I just thought it was part of the job. Yes. I think we have it coming anyway.
Okay, I'm working it
I'm involved in the DC Law Students in Court Clinic, which is students from all the schools in the area. And one thing I've noticed in working on my current case is the problems with the probation system in DC. I don't know. I think it probably extends everywhere in that I can see how it just sets people up to fail, essentially, the way it's done, and I think that contributes a lot to incarceration rates. You know, I had a client...
Reincarceration rates, yeah.
Right. You know, I had a client who pled guilty to obstruction of a 911 call, which is a misdemeanor offense, and he could be facing 180 days because of the impositions he faces like on a daily, weekly basis that he has to go through to be on probation. So...
Yeah, probation is a related issue. It's not the focal point here. Right. But you're right. I mean, again, it's part of the denominator. It's, well, you start adding up. In Maryland, the big issue when I was governor was 3-time loser, nonviolent offenders, daytime housebreakers. Now, nobody loves daytime housebreakers, right, G-Man? Right. Particularly if it's your house. So nobody likes daytime housebreakers, particularly if you're home during the day. 25 years, no parole? A little over the line? Where is the line? You know, this is where law and policy meet. This is why you're here in law school, to think about this stuff. As you heard the continuum as far as my cases, really easy to really difficult. Your issue is more a separate but related issue of probation agents, parole agents having too large caseloads, right? Just way too overwhelming caseload. That was the case in Maryland as well, which leads to reincarceration, which leads to inappropriate people being behind bars and taxpayers paying for it. And they're not dangerous. They're screw-ups, but they're not dangerous in many cases. And by the way, that at least partially can be remedied through funding. That's a dollars and cents issue. That's hiring more probation agents to reduce the caseload. Yes, 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 Carl.
Can you talk a little bit more about what the victim, you mentioned, I think you said victim communication, thank you. And maybe this is a question for Greg, but I wanted to hear a little bit more about how you interacted with victims. Did you do so having already made the decision to pardon?
No.
Or, okay, so they had an input into that. Okay, so if you could elaborate a little bit. And then also, I wanted to ask you to talk a little bit about the rehabilitative services you provided to people so that they would be successful in reentry.
You have to make your common sense here. As far as victim notification, if it was the fist fight from 30 years ago, we weren't going to go back and find the person who got in the bar fight with the guy. But if it was the aggravated assault from 6 years ago, we may have. If it was obviously some of the more real serious cases, the lifer cases and all that, the 25-year no parole and all that, we would talk to the victims. And as I said, that was the first part of the process. That was at the beginning of the process. The victim, if we could find them, sometimes they were deceased, sometimes we just couldn't track them down. But in the high-profile cases, we really put a lot of energy into tracking them down because we didn't want that phone call to the press. And we would say, here it is. You want to be heard? Now's your time. It's not your opinion is not dispositive with the governor, respectfully, but the governor wants your opinion. You have a right to be heard. And sometimes they'd say, oh, no, it's, I think the person's paid their price. I think that it's time to get on and whatever. Sometimes it was that person can rot in hell. And they again, were the more difficult cases. As far as reentry, and there's whole other, there's so much, you all could spend your lifetime on just these issues. Reentry, cognitive redevelopment behind bars, a program that we really put some energy into, which was resisted by a lot of folks in the system, by the way, for really bad reasons. Sometimes union issues, sometimes partisan issues. I had some of the leading criminal justice advocates in the legislature not support me because I was a Republican. And it was just too inconvenient for a Republican to do this stuff because it was counterintuitive. They just couldn't get their brain around it, which was very frustrating. cognitive redevelopment behind bars, putting resources, not midnight basketball, which is a pejorative here, but I'm talking about real reentry services for those who, Charlie, what you live, for those who we know are coming out. In the 80s, it was increasing the predicate offenses to get increasingly violent juveniles waved up into adult court. Today, it's, geez, you know what, throwing away the key, we forgot the second half of it. They're coming back. They're actually coming out. The sentence is going to be over at some point. 5 years no parole means after 5 years, they're up. What are you going to do about it? So we spent resources, considerable resources, now, we only started it. It has to be a nationwide effort. It has to be in the federal system. Governors have to treat it. It's dollars. It's psychologists, psychiatrists. It's occupational therapists. It's people actually taking the time to see what skills you have and helping you get ready when you get out. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Oh.
Further question, thoughts, Governor. Part of the discussion there also was how the individual coming out was going to be assisted.
Oh, yeah.
Whether they were going to have family members, they were going to bring them in, whether there were job opportunities for them. So that was all part of the conversation. Sorry, I didn't mean to take this mic.
Charlie, you lived that. That was a good point to you, man. We wanted to see a plan. Job, resources, family support, friend support, something support for the person coming out. Sure.
Hi, Governor. I'm wondering why you had your press secretary in the room with you when these decisions were made. Was public sentiment an issue that could sway your opinion?
No. He wished it was. No, because the reason is what I said. These were published decisions. So when we put them out, the press would call him. And Greg, you can answer that question. I mean, yeah.
And when he says published, we had to advertise for 2 weeks prior. So it was 2 weeks of being cut 1,000 times. You know, it was not a pleasant experience. Then you also had the follow-up. Well, how's this individual doing? What's happening? You never got credit, and not that he was ever looking for credit. My job was to try to find the credit. He's not only the governor, he's my governor, he's my friend. So, you know, it was, wait a minute, why are we doing this? What are we doing? But clearly it was the right decision, and when you combine it with his restart program, his work behind, helping those behind bars, his judge appointments, all that was all involved in the process. And yeah, you know, I'm being made to sound like a Neanderthal.
Well, you are.
But there were occasions, these were really tough decisions, and they had worked other places. Why were we going to be the guys going out in a state that was very difficult? You know, it's a governor, Republican governor, first time in 36 years in Maryland. Why are we going to do this? To his credit, it was because it was the right thing to do.
And there was one case in that respect. So that's the answer to your question. Sometimes you can't win in politics. Very high-profile case in the Jewish community. A cause celeb for a group of Orthodox rabbis. I had deep support in the Orthodox Jewish community. And I had, for a Republican, pretty good support in the Jewish community. And so this case came to me, and it was a murder case. And it was a really hard case. So if I granted the relief, it would look like I'm trying to placate a Jewish constituency. And which I wasn't trying to do. It was just a case that we should have looked at, and we did look at. And in this case, we happened to grant relief. But even doing the right thing in that case, gosh, oh, that's early being political. So sometimes you just can't win. And if you really worry about that, you're in the wrong business.
Am I good to go?
Yes.
My question is pretty broad. I was wondering what your opinion of the efficacy of the drug war is.
It's totally failed.
Okay. I'll ask a follow-up. How would you change the war on drugs to solve the problems it aims at?
Wow. There's always one. It's the most difficult question in the criminal justice system today, because I'm not a huge advocate for legalization either, because I've been in too many juvenile. I've seen too much addiction. I've seen too many families. I've seen too many dysfunctional kids. I've seen too many lives ruined. So, I have some ideas as far as clearly the circa 80s statutes and the criminal sentencing initiatives from the sentencing committee at the federal level have failed. So that's just fixing that is a huge part, I think, of the solution. No doubt about that. Nonviolent possession offenses, that's relatively easy stuff. Yeah. But when you get into the more difficult cases, violent distribution cases, I'm not going to decriminalize that stuff. These are people who will necessarily look at you and kill you. And they do. So less addiction in the culture would certainly help. We talk about gun control. It's less an issue in the country now for some reason, because whether you're pro-gun or anti-gun or believe everybody should have a pistol or handgun or bazooka, whatever you are, it's a consequence of a larger issue. If you took the drug culture out of the gun equation, we really wouldn't have much gun violence in this country. We just wouldn't. And in areas where there's not such a drug issue, there's very little gun violence. So, again, you could talk about dysfunctional families, single or no-parent households. They're generally repercussions of this insatiable demand in our culture for illegal drugs. Some people can handle candy bars. Some people can't. Some people can handle sugar. Some people can handle cigars. Some people can handle cocaine. But some people can't. A lot of people can't. And so we pay a price. And I'm not moralizing. I'm just pointing out facts that everybody in this room knows. So what to do about it? I mean, I don't know. I know one thing, that attacking the supply end was a mistake, and that was a bipartisan mistake. And a lot of my friends in Congress would go to Columbia every couple months. They were on the Committee of Jurisdiction. I spent a weekend with the Border Patrol and the Coast Guard and DEA and all sorts of other acronyms, getting sick on little boats outside on the Florida Keys in Congress. And I came back the most depressed I've ever been, besides being sick. Because it was a great week, and they interdicted maybe 8 to 10% of what was coming into the country. And so if you're focusing on the demand side and trying to convince farmers in Colombia to not grow cocoa, it's not going to work, because they're poor and they're going to do what raises money. If you're going to focus, on supply. If you're going to focus on demand, we make my kids watch there's addiction shows. Do you ever see those addiction shows on A&E? It's funny, but it's not funny, because these are real people. And I have a 13-year-old and an 8-year-old, and they're great kids, they're great boys, and they're all clean cut and all that, and I'm scared to death. So it's a decision for our culture, for every one of you individually next Saturday night. And those a lot younger, too, and older. So clearly the war with respect to supply will always fail, because economics 101, right? As long as the demand's there, supply will follow. And we've wasted a lot of resources on it. And we've lost a lot of lives on it. So I wish you could hear that in the debates. The polls will probably go down. Yes?
I was just wondering, what was the toughest decision that you had to make in regards to this during your administration?
Individual case?
Yeah.
Wow. not one stands out. The lifer cases are the hardest because these are commutation cases, and I know, and they're murder cases, obviously. They're lifer cases. So I know my decision in those cases will result in that person getting out of jail because we're going to commute it to a term of years, we're going to qualify for parole, and they're going to be out. And they're really tough calls. They're really tough calls because somebody's dead. And the person I'm giving relief to had something to do with it, but maybe not enough to be in jail for 40 years or 30 years or 20 years. Yeah, and listen, it's interesting because I am pro-capital punishment, and I had 2 cases go all the way when I was governor. And I thought that they would be incredibly difficult for me emotionally coming into office. I'll never forget, I've never said this in public. One of my first days in office, my secretary, my corrections secretary came to me and said, here's the process. I'm going to walk you through it. Here's what's going to happen. You talk about sort of, whoa. Okay. And for the next hour or two, I got walked through the process of what a governor does when someone is going through that process on his or her last day. And the phone call, we all talk about the phone call. Well, the phone call is real. The governor makes the phone call or doesn't. You're the last stop in the criminal justice process. And I had 2 go all the way as governor. And it was not as emotionally difficult for me as I thought it would be. I obviously did a lot of work on the cases, but the cases were incredibly egregious and incredibly horrific.
Thank you for coming, Governor. Do you think it's possible that the reason why governors aren't more proactive on this issue is because the system might be antiquated and perhaps they should form a committee or perhaps a second jury in states?
No, that's not it. That's not it. You would maybe in some cases, in some states, but in most states, and Margie Love is the expert here, a friend of ours, all of ours in the front row here. In most cases, the governor has either unilateral authority or almost unilateral authority. You know, there's a board, but there's a process in place in every state. It's really not a function of antiquated process. It's a function of political guts. Have I defeated you? Uh-oh, no.
On the topic of political guts, I guess, do you think that one of the reasons the DOJ is resistant to pardons is the Markridge issue?
The Markridge issue, obviously, being the Clinton era. And Margie Love, obviously, was the pardons attorney who can tell you all about that. As I said, one of the central, if you carry nothing away today from this, it's if you have regular processes, you follow regular process, you tend to not create bad news stories. When you act outside the process, when you do extraordinary things, when you pull surprises, when you do a big-time caseload, when you've been doing small cases, that's when the press goes, let's look into this. So it's not a game. It's just when you violate those rules, you're going to get hit, and you're going to pay a price. I don't think it's that as much as prosecutors protecting their record, prosecutors protecting other prosecutors. As I said, you're talking to people in the system who put the person away. And you're trying to undo something later on. And it could really hurt them, particularly if there was a sensitive issue such as race or assistance of counsel, issues that are career killers. So there's not a lot of impetus, there's not a lot of motive in the system to fix it. That's the problem, in my view. And governors can do it if they want to.
Did your successor as governor continue the progress you had made?
No. No further comment. violent.
I was just wondering if you found any correlation to education with the inmates, their level of education,
Oh, yeah.
and is there anything that you think can be done in that regard as to maybe in rehabilitative practices, or does that sort of come from the ground up?
No, you're clearly, I mean, first of all, you don't need a study. You all know it. You know it intuitively. My wife would talk about, she would just go crazy about these women when she was a public defender, and they would, typical pattern, 6 kids, 3 or 4 fathers. She's dropped out. She has an addiction. What's her future? And she would come home and I don't know if you guys remember this, but we had an incident with the First Lady. She didn't mean to cause national news, but she did. She was speaking to a domestic violence conference about this very subject. And as First Lady, because she had a bully pulpit as First Lady, she really wanted to get the message out, particularly to women, young women, stay in school, please. And it was during a time when Britney Spears was really big. And she was talking about the sexualization of young girls, too, and just the messages from Hollywood and just all the negative messages to young girls. And she said, if I could shoot Britney Spears, I would. So she came home that night. I said, how was your day, dear? And she said, fine. Nothing that night. Next day, nothing. And then the next day, you start getting calls. Well, it's never good when you wake up to the First Lady's voice on the radio morning news and your governor. And so Britney Spears had gotten a hold, somebody had reported this to her, and she shot back, Kendall Ehrlich needs to get laid. Kendall Ehrlich was pregnant at the time. Nobody knew it, and we had not announced it, which we got a little hoot out of. So that day, it's a true story. So he comes over. We got to do something. There's press conference from all over the world. It's on the NBC nightly news. And so, as governor, I used to have the press wait for me outside the mansion. I walk out. That morning, I walked out right to my office. Nobody followed me. It was great. They were all waiting for her. And this is a true story. And so Kendall had a press conference. She invited Brittany. But the point to Maryland, she invited Brittany to Maryland, and she had some other nasty thing to say. Anyway, but she was speaking to this domestic violence conference about, and one of her great frustrations as a lawyer and as First Lady and as an advocate for women is what she saw. And education was always, the lack of education was always the cause. And then the addiction followed. And then, getting beat up, and we were talking about this earlier, getting beat up repeatedly and showing up in court hand in hand with the boyfriend. So education is just it. It just is. So GED programs are absolutely essential behind bars. I've defeated you, I think. Good luck, everybody. Take care. Godspeed.